Dear participants and Jayantians, I would like to bring to your notice a few general instructions. As Sir mentioned in the beginning, please make sure that you join with your audio. Keep your microphone mute when you are not speaking. Also, enable the videos if only required. Do not get distracted by your mobile phones. Be active and make the sessions interactive. And finally, students, please maintain the Jayanti and decorum. I'll quote, economics as it has emerged can be made more productive by paying greater and more explicit attention to the ethical considerations that shape human behavior and judgment. Amartya Sen. A very warm good morning to one and all present here. The most respected chief guest of the day, Dr. Alex M. Thomas, Assistant Professor, Azim Premji University, Bengaluru. Dr. Aloysius Edward, Dean of Commerce and Management. Dr. K. Vinoda Devi, Head of the Department of Economics. All the faculty members, participants from around the nation, and dear Jayantians. November 3, 1933, the realm of economic science in general and Indian economic studies in particular marked the birth of an enlightened economist, Amartya Sen. He has been called the conscience of the profession and the Mother Teresa of economics for his work on famine, human development theory, welfare economics, the underlying mechanisms of poverty, gender inequality, and political liberalism. We have come together today in this platform for the special virtual lecture on the valuable contributions of this stalwart organized by the Department of Economics, Kristu Jayanti College. Prayer is raising of one's mind and heart to God. I now call upon the department choir for the invocation. A small cheer and a great welcome make a merry feast. I am extremely delighted to offer a hospitable welcome to this auspicious gathering. Today, we have amidst us an eminent resource person, Dr. Alex M. Thomas, who serves as the Assistant Professor of Azim Premji University, Bengaluru. He is here to provide us valuable insights on the notable contributions of Professor Amartya Sen and their relevance in the current scenario. Thank you, sir, for your time, and I extend a warm welcome on the behalf of the Department of Economics, Kristu Jayanti College. Next, I welcome Dr. Aloysius Edward, Dean of Commerce and Management, who serves as a vibrant source of inspiration and support in every venture of the department. Welcome you, sir, to this webinar. I also take this opportunity to welcome Dr. K. Vinoda Devi, Head, Department of Economics. She has been the driving force of our department. It's my privilege and honor to welcome you, ma'am. I also extend a cheerful welcome to all the faculty members of the Department of Economics, the participants of today's webinar, and all the Jayantians. Once again, welcome you all. I now call upon Mr. Nirmal of second year MA Economics to introduce the resource person. Over to Mr. Nirmal.
A very pleasant morning to one and all present here. It gives me immense pleasure to introduce our resource person for the day, Mr. Alex M. Thomas. Sir has received his economics education from the University of Madras, Hyderabad, and completed his PhD in economics from University of Sydney. Sir has published in both national and international journals such as Arthavignana, Economic and Political Weekly, European Journal of History of Economic Thought, History of Economic Ideas, History of Economic Review, and Journal of Interdisciplinary Economics. While his commentary on the Indian economy is often published as blog posts occasionally, they have found their way to Huffington Post India, The Hindu, and The Jacobin. He currently teaches an elective on the history of economic thought to undergraduate and postgraduate students. He has taught history of economic thought, intermediate macroeconomics, quantitative reasoning for humanities, understanding India, growth theory, and advanced writing in the last 4 years at the undergraduate level. Prior to joining Azim Premji University, Sir has taught micro and macroeconomics to undergraduate students at the University of Sydney. He is currently working on a textbook on the history of economic thought. Sir has given invited lectures on classical economies, Indian economy, and history of economic thought in various institutions all over India. He also delivered the economics lecture at the first Bangalore Center University Nobel Lecture Series 2018 and the 14th Dr. M.V. Commemorative Lecture at Union Christian College, Alua 2019 on Adam Smith and his contemporary relevance. On this auspicious occasion, we are extremely delighted to have you with us, sir. I now request you to take over the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Nirmal, and thank you, Tesma, for that wonderful introduction. And before I share the slides, I would really like to extend my thanks to Dr. Vinoda Devi for inviting me here. And in fact, I would like to also mention that I've come to Kristu Jayanti twice before to talk about various aspects of history of economic thought. So I'm extremely delighted to do that again, although not physically, but I think in presence at least. So having said that, let me share the screen. Yeah, and I would again I'm extremely delighted to be here also because this has given me an opportunity to go through Amartya Sen's contributions in a much more detailed manner. And so what I'm going to talk about, as some of you already, Tesma already pointed out that his contributions are so many. So given our limited time, I'm just going to focus on one aspect of his contribution and place it within the history of economic thought approach. So these are the content of my presentation, and I'll take about 40 to 45 minutes. And let me just, yeah. So I'm going to start off by talking about two paradigms broadly in economics: the surplus approach and the marginalist approach. Then I'm going to talk about Sen and his contributions to welfare economics, but a particular kind of welfare economics which falls within the marginalist approach. And in particular, in this lecture, I'm really going to focus on his capabilities approach. Although he has made several contributions, I think the capabilities approach has been fundamental, and it has been used and continues to be used today. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about Sen's position or his views on Adam Smith. And then I'm going to, this is towards the end, I'll talk a little bit about Adam Smith, and then I'll conclude. So this is going to be the outline for today's talk. So to start off with, let me just point out that there are two paradigms in economics broadly. One can be called the surplus approach, and the other is a marginalist approach. Most of you would be familiar with the marginalist approach because that is what is primarily taught in universities. Now, the surplus approach is slightly different, so I'm going to talk about the surplus approach first. It adopts what can be called methodological holism, where it uses social classes. So the basic unit of analysis or the foundational unit of analysis is a social class. So you can talk of capitalists or workers or landlords. It also adopts what might be called an objective theory of value, objective in the sense that, for instance, it uses labor or you have a labor theory of value, and labor can be measured in an objective sense. That is, it can be measured in terms of the number of hours worked or the number of days worked. So that's why it's called an objective theory of value. It is called the surplus approach because once production is carried out and it is marketed, there is a surplus that is available which can be distributed. Now, it can be distributed in terms of wages and profits, and a portion of that can also be taken by the government and used for redistribution. So surplus has to be allocated by some sort of political and policy processes. And wages in this paradigm or in this approach is determined exogenously. And in particular, people write about history and culture. So for instance, one can think today that workers' movements or women's rights movements have played a role in what the wages are today. So this is broadly in some key sense, the surplus approach. Now let's talk of the marginalist approach. In the marginalist approach, what we see is when you study microeconomics, you start off with individuals or Robinson Crusoe. You start off with Robinson Crusoe, you have individual firms. They adopt what can be called the methodological individualist approach, where the fundamental unit of analysis is an individual. And often they are asocial individuals, at least in the traditional way it is taught. And they adopt a subjective theory of value, where value is really given by the marginal utility. Now, because utility is a subjective measure, it differs from person to person. That's why it's called a subjective theory of value. And there is really no surplus in this marginalist approach due to what is known as the product exhaustion theorem. Again, I'm not going to get into the details. I'm assuming that most of you would have covered this, but you can look that up. And wages are determined endogenously. And this is, wages are determined according to the marginal productivity theory of income distribution. That is, under conditions of competition in equilibrium, you have wages equal to the marginal product of labor. And this is determined completely within the system. And this is why it is said that wages are determined endogenously in the marginalist approach. So these are broadly the two paradigms. And I think it is important to understand these two paradigms to be able to situate and to appreciate Amartya Sen's contributions. So just to give an overview, or just to give an indication of who the select economists are, and I've put this book here. This is written by Krishna Bharadwaj, who used to teach at JNU. She's no more now. And so this particular book is useful if you want to know more about these two approaches. And it's a small book. It's probably just about a little over 100 pages. And these are some of the select economists that follow the surplus approach. So you have Smith, Ricardo, Marx, Sraffa, Garignani, and Krishna Bharadwaj, some select people. Within the marginalist approach, some of the more famous or known ones are Jevons, Walras, Marshall, Pigou, Samuelson, Solo. So this is just to give an indication of groups of economists who follow the surplus approach and the marginalist approach. Now, so that was by way of introduction so that you can situate Amartya Sen's work. So now let's get on with what is the meaning of welfare economics. So first of all, it is important to recognize that welfare economics is a subfield of marginalist economics. And if you actually recall what I mentioned in the first slide, in the surplus approach, it is well understood that surplus has to be redistributed for some kind of welfare. So there was, if you look at the work of Adam Smith or Ricardo or Karl Marx, it is clear that welfare is an integral part of their political economy. So there was no real need for a separate subfield of welfare economics. So in that sense, it is important to recognize that welfare economics is a subfield of marginalist economics. And the traditional welfare economics was sort of started off with Bentham, Edgeworth, Marshall, Pigou, and the basis was fundamentally utilitarian in nature. So they understood welfare in the following way, that one had to maximize total utility. So if the community as a whole or the economy as a whole tried to maximize total utility, it meant that you were achieving greater welfare. Then in the 1940s, a new welfare economics was born. And then what happened was the sole criteria for understanding or recognizing welfare in a way became the idea of Pareto efficiency, which says that nobody, at this point, you cannot make anyone better off without making someone else worse off. So this was a very peculiar, particular kind of criteria. And this is even today much used, and it is called Pareto efficiency. But the problem that Amartya Sen identified with this kind of new welfare economics is that it had no interest in distributional issues. That is, you were only interested in the efficient outcome or the efficient equilibrium. You were not interested in whether whether one person was poor or the other person was rich. So no questions of distribution was really addressed. Now comes in the link between welfare economics and social choice theory. So social choice is essentially an account of how from individual choices you can have some sort of a decision making for the economy as a whole. And in this context, Kenneth Arrow's contributions are particularly important. In 1950 and 1951, he came up with what is called the social welfare function. That is, from individuals, you can arrive at the social welfare, individual welfare to the social welfare function. But here, Kenneth Arrow made a very interesting and important observation or a finding, which is what is called the Impossibility Theorem, which says that everybody's preferences cannot be consistently represented by an aggregate preference or the social welfare function. This was found out particularly with respect to voting preferences. And therefore, within this broader contributions, Arrow claimed that interpersonal comparisons of utilities has no meaning. That is, you cannot compare the utility of individual A with individual B, because that has no meaning whatsoever. Then later, Amartya Sen was, I think Amartya Sen came to know of Kenneth Arrow's contributions when he was a student at Calcutta University. And in his biography, he writes that it was Sukhamoy Chakravarti, who was then his classmate and friend, who actually introduced Amartya Sen to Kenneth Arrow's contributions. So later, Amartya Sen's contributions are in response to Kenneth Arrow's contributions. In his work, Amartya Sen sort of shows that you can make interpersonal comparisons to some extent. And he also underscores that social choice is sensitive to inequalities and in well-being and opportunity. So in other words, it is important to recognize inequalities to be able to say something about social choice. And it is important to make interpersonal comparisons. So this then brings me, so if you look at his book, Development is Freedom, it then brings me to what Amartya Sen is trying to do, which is he's trying to make welfare economics, which initially just focused on total utility. Then it focused on Pareto efficiency. So he's trying to make it more practical. He's trying to make it much more practical in the sense that how can we use it today to meet some of our contemporary development requirements. So in that sense, there was already a tradition of welfare economics, which was largely applied in nature, but they looked at studies of expenditure patterns. Right? So that literature already existed. Sen actually championed and strengthened this, and he brought in social choice theory, and he called it constructive social choice theory because there was a practical element to social choice theory now. And what was his focus and how did he do it? And that is through the capabilities approach. His Amartya Sen's focus was then, or focus was during that period, interpersonal comparisons of well-being. So how does individual A compare to individual B in terms of their well-being? how do we understand deprivation or the lack of well-being? How do we understand deprivation? But it is important to recognize that even then there were studies which were conducted on personal income distribution, but not in the framework in which Amartya Sen was talking about it. So to put it very shortly or crudely, Amartya Sen's aim is really to develop welfare economics and social choice theory such that it is practical in the sense that it can be used today to engage with policy issues of today. So his aim is really to convert that the realm of theory into something that can be utilized today. So now let me get into some of the details of the capabilities approach, which will help us understand it better. So one is that the capabilities approach can provide a general framework for analyzing individual advantage and deprivation in a contemporary society. And this is a quotation that I've taken from Amartya Sen. So all the quotations in this presentation are taken from Amartya Sen's writing. Right? So it is a general framework, and it is able to analyze individual advantage and deprivation. In other words, the capabilities approach is a framework or an approach for practical application. Or again, to put it differently, it is really a theory for public action. Right? So what can we do today and how do we act upon it? So it's really a theory in that sense, or it's a theory for public action. And Sen is dissatisfied with interpersonal evaluations. So there were evaluations of between two individuals or more, interpersonal evaluations, which were based on utility and specifically total utility. This Sen is extremely dissatisfied with because of a subjective basis, and he thinks that utility and welfare need not go together. Also, he thinks that utility can be, as already mentioned, it can be determined by inequalities to a large extent. Amartya Sen is also dissatisfied with interpersonal evaluations which are based on commodities. How much of commodities does a person have, or incomes? So the focus on income alone for making interpersonal evaluation is not something Amartya Sen is satisfied with. So what is Sen's candidate, or what is Sen's alternative to utility and commodities? According to Sen, what we should be focusing on is capabilities. And according to Sen, capabilities, I quote, can be a partial guide to the part of moral goodness that is associated with the idea of equality. So in some sense, capabilities represent some notion of morals and ethics, which is associated with the idea of equality. And according to Sen, this has to be at the center of welfare economics or applied welfare economics. And this is also important. This is what economists should be focusing on. And he claims that capabilities is what we should assess, and we should not really be looking at utility and commodities alone. So why not utility and why not commodities or means of commodities or income? According to Sen, utility is subjective and influenced by social context. Therefore, utility cannot and does not provide adequate information of well-being. So he's basically, Amartya Sen is trying to expand the informational set that economists have to be able to develop policies which can improve individuals' well-being. What about commodities or income? Why is that not satisfactory? According to Sen, commodities and income are simply a means to an end. Right? The end in itself could be better nutrition, could be health, could be self-respect. Right? So he argues that we should not only focus on the means, but we should also focus on the ends. Right? So, and this is the reason for it, that evaluation or assessment. Right? So when we're using the capabilities approach, according to Sen, evaluation or assessment must be of the ends and not necessarily of the means, because more food does not necessarily imply better nutrition. because more health expenditure does not necessarily imply better health. So because of these reasons, Amartya Sen argues that it is important to focus on the ends or the capabilities that we are really interested in, such as nutrition, health, self-respect, literacy, etc. And now I'll talk a little bit about capabilities soon, but the conversion of capabilities into functioning. So there are two terms that often comes up. One is the idea of capabilities, and functioning is the actual realized output, or what you actually consume or what you actually obtain. This depends on the individual's freedom or choice set. So the way in which Amartya Sen defines freedom is, if the individual has a broad set of choices from where she is able to make a particular consumption decision or any other kind of well-being decision, then it means that the individual is free. So freedom and unfreedom are understood by the ability of an individual to convert capabilities into functionings. And at this point, I just want to highlight that, notice what is happening here, which is that generally when we think of theory, we are only thinking of a broad guide to action. But with Amartya Sen's capabilities approach, theory in a way is brought very, very close to actual policy making and actual politics, and saying that this is what one should focus on when you are undertaking any kind of policy. Right? So actually the distance between theory and policy that generally exists is being reduced via this capabilities approach. And because of this kind of, what it enables empirical economists to do, this has been significant. This has been widely used in empirical development economics. And in fact, I would think that today we don't really talk of welfare economics so much, but there's a lot of literature on empirical development economics, which it can also be said there's a lot of work on RCTs, which use random controlled trials in development economics. There's a lot of work which use microeconometrics in development economics. All of them are largely empirical and are largely quantitative in nature. They all try to assess quantitatively various aspects. In a way, I think that this can be understood as a kind of welfare economics, although this is not the term that is used. So let me just get into a little bit of the mechanics of it. So what microeconomic theory tells us when you study it, or marginalist value theory tells us, is the following. Let's say that I want to consume food and clothing. You have the budget constraint and you have an indifference curve, which contains details of your utility. And the equilibrium price corresponds to the marginal utilities. So in some sense, relative price is equal to their relative marginal utilities. And remember, clothing and food are commodities. So this is not, this is sense criticism that clothing might be for self-respect, food might be for nutrition. So if we just focus on clothing or food, we are not really able to understand their capabilities. So now, this I've just tried to give a visual representation. This is not exact, but this is just for purpose of understanding. So what I've tried to do is I've tried to put capabilities approach in a more visual way. And many of you might recall that the image that I've used is similar to the production possibility frontier that is there in microeconomics, in marginalist microeconomics. So what I've put is, instead of clothing, what an individual is interested in is self-respect. Instead of food, what an individual is interested in is nutrition. And you have this capability set. The actual functioning, the way in which you convert the capabilities into actual functioning, depends on wide range of freedoms and unfreedoms that an individual has. So even though you have a capacity to consume or obtain more of self-respect and nutrition, you might be exercising your choice when your actual functioning is actually lower than the capabilities. And Sen's important point is this: the distance between the actual functioning or the capabilities or the entire capability set itself gives you an indication of the degree of freedom or unfreedom that you have. But suppose we were to just focus only on actual functionings, right? Only what is actually consumed in terms of food and what is consumed in terms of clothing, you would not be able to understand the degree of choice the individual has and therefore the capabilities the individual has, and that is not giving us a right assessment of the individual's freedom in some sense. So that's a key point. And then this allows, according to Sen, some sort of interpersonal comparison. And what I've drawn here is the following. So there can be an individual whose capability set is represented by the dotted line, the dotted blue line, and the actual functioning might be there. Now, there can also be another individual whose capabilities are represented by the curved black line, which is higher. But if you look at the actual functioning, that is, if you just study the commodities, how much of food and how much of clothing is consumed, both of them might be consuming the same amount because of various preferences or various other reasons. But if you just look at the actual functionings, it is unable to communicate and to tell us clearly how much of freedom that individual has in making this choice. And the distance, I mean, in this way, you are able to, if you compare the black line and the dotted line, you're able to get some sense of the difference in capabilities between two individuals. And this is what Sen thinks is more important than just comparing the amount that is spent on food and clothing. And if you look at it this way, you're able to get a better understanding of freedom and unfreedom, or deprivation and well-being. So let me now move ahead. But when you actually look at Amartya Sen's work or his writing on the capabilities approach, it is quite clear that he has no foundational or fundamental dissatisfaction with the marginalist notion of Pareto efficiency as such, but this needs to be qualified because he is critical of it. But he says that we need to focus on equity. If you remember, the new welfare economics focused only on efficiency or Pareto efficiency, and Amartya Sen's role was to bring in the additional criterion of equity. And this he has brought in through the capabilities approach and in the form of talking about freedoms and unfreedoms. And because of this additional focus on equity, he argues that it is important to have public investment in public goods such as health, nutrition, sanitation, literacy. Right? Because efficiency does not, I mean, it cannot capture these things. And because there are issues of equity, we need to invest, I mean, government needs to invest in things such capabilities such as health, nutrition, sanitation, and literacy to meet equity considerations. And according to Sen, other things or market will provide certain things which is efficient in nature, and that is also important. So for Amartya Sen, the question of efficiency is important. So he's not arguing that the market should not provide anything. The markets will provide certain goods and services, and that promotes efficiency. But in order to take care of public, I mean, capabilities such as health, nutrition, sanitation, and literacy, in the interest of equity, the government needs to put some resources. And it is actually in this way that Amartya Sen enlarges the theoretical and empirical scope of marginalist economics, especially through his contributions to social choice theory and welfare economics. Now, in the theoretical aspect, you're not just focusing on questions of efficiency, but you're also looking at questions of equity. In the empirical element, you're not just looking at food and clothing, but you're looking at the capabilities about nutrition, about self-respect, about health. And I think this is, I mean, it is in this way that one can argue that Amartya Sen has brought in a humane side to economics, but I would qualify it by saying that it is a humane side only to marginalist economics, which is the dominant way of doing economics. And before I move on to Amartya Sen's views on Adam Smith, I'm just going to leave some questions for you to think about. I'm not really going to address them, but maybe if it comes in the Q&A session, I might address it. But otherwise, these are just questions for you to think about. So the first question is, do you think whether, I mean, you can go back and look at Sen, but does Amartya Sen endorse the marginless value or price theory, where price are some way represented by the marginal utilities, right? So I've Px by Py is equal to Mux by Muy. The question is, why does Sen prefer methodological individualism? Remember that he's talking about individuals. He's talking about individual well-being. He's talking about how individual choices can reach social choice. He's talking about interpersonal comparisons. Welfare economists have, I mean, there is a call to measure nutrition because it is an important capability, but does welfare economics or development economics actually possess a theory of nutrition? Is there an explanation of nutrition, or is there just it is just about measurement of nutrition? The question is, I mean, Sen is critical of Pareto efficiency, but he does not think that there is a big problem as long as you add on issues of equity. And this is a general question. Do you think that Pareto efficiency is a desirable aim? So there is a history of Pareto efficiency, actually how it was never considered to be a policy aim, but today if you look at policy documents today, you would notice that efficiency is repeated again and again as a desirable aim for policy. So why is Pareto efficiency a desirable aim? And this is the last question. I pointed out two ways of how wages are determined in the two paradigms. One is the endogenous way, which is the marginalist way, and the other is exogenous by history and culture. The question is, what kind of functional income distribution, that is the income distribution that goes to workers and capitalists, what kind of functional income distribution does Sen believe in? Is it the marginal productivity theory? So these are some questions to ponder. And now I'm going to move to talk about Amartya Sen on Adam Smith. And let me just mention that this book, which was brought out recently, maybe in the last decade or so, by Penguin. This is a theory of moral sentiments, which Adam Smith wrote before The Wealth of Nations. It has an introduction by Amartya Sen. And this book on ethics and economics is an earlier work by Amartya Sen. So I think that Amartya Sen traces some of his capabilities approach to Adam Smith. And that is why I think I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about Adam Smith. So Amartya Sen traces the roots of the capabilities approach to Adam Smith, but he also mentions Aristotle and Karl Marx. And in fact, in Adam Smith, you find the notion of necessaries. What does this notion mean? Smith says that for everyone, there has to be certain elements which has to be essential. Right? So today we could think in terms of maybe a similar notion today would be the right to education. Right? It is considered a right. One can talk about maybe the right to employment or the right to self-respect. Right? So all these can be considered as some sort of necessaries that everybody should have. But Smith is primarily talking about commodities, but it can be extended to, because he is talking about the notion of self-respect. This is considered to be necessary because it gives one self-respect. According to Amartya Sen, Sen also talks about Adam Smith because of this connection between ethics and economics, which Amartya Sen is interested in. After all, Adam Smith was a professor of moral philosophy. And there is an ethical approach to economics. According to the way in which Amartya Sen puts it is, you have an ethical approach to economics and you have an engineering approach to economics. So according to Sen, Smith has an ethical approach, and people like Walrus, which is what we generally study in microeconomics today, has a more engineering approach. And Sen talks about Smith in the context of self-interest as well, which is to be understood very differently from the kind of utility maximizing individuals that you study in microeconomic theory. And if you're interested, I would also recommend that you read Amartya Sen's Introduction to the Theory of Moral Sentiments. Now, the surplus approach of Adam Smith, so the book that I've mentioned here is if you're really interested in getting a detailed understanding of Adam Smith's work, you can look at this book by Tony Aspromorgos, which is titled The Science of Wealth. What does the surplus approach of Adam Smith contain? And I've already mentioned this when I spoke about the two paradigms. One is methodological holism. So Adam Smith is trying to understand a society and an economy on the basis of social classes. And according to Adam Smith, wages are determined by customary subsistence. That is, what is custom? And it is substantially determined by history and culture. Adam Smith also has some sort of a labor theory of value, broadly, so what it can be said, an objective theory of value. And he has this very interesting distinction between social, what is goods which are considered to be necessaries, conveniences, and luxuries. And this is also socially and historically determined. And according to Smith, he would argue that education is necessary. So the reason I've put the surplus approach of Adam Smith here is also to give you a sort of slight contrast with the marginalist approach that we spoke about earlier, and how Amartya Sen's contributions to welfare economics also fall within the larger marginalist paradigm. So this is one of the final points, and then I'll get to the conclusions. I've done some work on Adam Smith's views on education, and that's what I've put up on the right. And education in Smith is seen as a necessary good. And the reason Adam Smith provides are the following. One of it is that, according to him, it offsets the negative effects from division of labor, because there's a cognitive effect because you keep on doing the same job over and over again in an industrial setting. Smith also believes that education is necessary for democratic functioning. And therefore, he argues that education should be necessary and available for all and accessible for all. And therefore, education has to be publicly provided. Sen has a sort of different view. Education is a public good. The concept of a public good has marginalist underpinnings. It is true that education/literacy is an important capability according to Sen. But Amartya Sen would argue in the tradition of marginalist economics that because of externalities, positive externalities, the market cannot price education properly. And therefore, the government must provide education. So what I want you to contrast is, if you go through the surplus approach, if you go through Smith, you're going to arrive at the public provision of education. If you go through the marginalist approach, if you take Amartya Sen's capabilities approach, and you understand education as a public good, you're also going to arrive at the same conclusion that the government must provide education. So in terms of now a few slides on conclusion, one can argue that Amartya Sen expanded the scope of marginalist economics. So just one paradigm in economics, and he certainly expanded the scope of marginalist economics, as particularly in the domain of welfare economics, social choice theory, development economics. There's been a focus on interpersonal comparisons of well-being. So in some sense, the question of equity, the humane question, as it were, was brought into marginalist economics in a substantial manner, and primarily empirical assessments of well-being. But it is important to sort of remember that there is no fundamental dissatisfaction with the marginalist notion of Pareto efficiency per se, as long as equity concerns are addressed. So what I want to leave you with, apart from what I mentioned earlier, is some questions to think about. How do we understand somebody's contribution? So one is to understand it within the larger domain of economics, but economics has so many different paradigms, or at least two paradigms, and different schools of thought. So how do we critically evaluate somebody's contribution from within that school of thought that is internal to marginalist economics and external to marginalist economics? And I think that this is where broadly one can say the history and philosophy of economic ideas and paradigms become important. So it's important to study these contributions in a broader context or a broader frame. And finally, the question of is theory a means to an end? Because as I pointed to you in the case of public education, Smith has a very different approach. He adopts the surplus approach. He has a methodological holist perspective, whereas Amartya Sen adopts the marginalist approach and he has a methodological individualist perspective. But both of them, at least in the question of public education, arrive at the same conclusion. Right? So then the question as students of economics for you is, does the choice of theory matter? So the references that I've focused on, I've only looked at these references in a focused manner. I've not looked at other works of Amartya Sen. So the 1979 work, Equality of What? This was the Tanner lecture. Also looked at the book Ethics and Economics. And then there was a critical journal article published in 1989, which is called The Development as Capability Expansion. Then The Possibility of Social Choice, which was his Nobel lecture, and Development as Freedom. So if you're interested in the capabilities approach, these articles from 1979 to 1999 give you, an overview of how it started off. The idea of capabilities really is just somewhat present in the 1979 lecture, but it is expanded until you reach 1999. And so if you want to, I think, get a good sense of the capabilities approach, reading these references would be adequate. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We are indeed honored to hear from you. Your investment in knowledge has paid the best interest. Thank you, sir, for your valuable insights on the subject. Yes, now the session is open for queries. The participants, please note, you can raise hand and ask questions if you have any. Kindly note, it's time for interaction. Participants can raise hand and you will be unmuted so that you can ask questions.
Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, sir, this is Rajesh from IIT Indore. Sir, I would like to ask question that as I have understood the development process, or development as freedom book that argues the expansion of human capabilities through the provision of basic political and social freedoms along with economic entitlements. Right, sir?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. So I was trying to ask that at the current situation where the most of the countries in the world are going through authoritarianism, so it's very difficult to get the individual freedom. It may be social freedom or political freedom. So all the social and political freedoms are neglected in most of the authoritarian countries. So how would you look this situation? That in that situation, how can we expand our capabilities or maximize our welfare, individual welfare? So what is your views?
Okay, so I don't think I am in any way qualified to answer your question because you're asking a question of what is my view on freedom or unfreedom, and how can one maximize individual freedom. And I don't think that from whatever I've said so far, which is the capabilities approach, and which is also the point that I made briefly, that do economists have a theory of freedom, or are we just measuring economic freedom? Right? I asked the question of, do we have a theory of nutrition, or are we just measuring nutrition? And I think that for understanding to respond to your question, we would have to read more from the other social sciences, maybe from political science, maybe from history, maybe from literature, to actually find out what we can do. But I'm hesitant to comment because I don't think I can give an answer to that. Also, I think I want to mention this, that economics as a subject, I mean, is just one of the many social sciences that we use to understand society and to take some sort of action. So I think that we should be engaging with other social science subjects too, to have a comprehensive understanding and to be able to really make it more applicable in, let's say, a more practical context, especially in relation to your question of freedoms. I think I see two people who have raised their hands.
One more question is there. Sylvia Raha, please answer.
Yes. I'm Sylvia Raha from West Bengal. I teach in St. Xavier's College. Sir, I have not a question, it's just an understanding that I actually want from you. As Amartya Sen has talked about development, and he has analyzed strategically how the development would be in a form of freedom. Here my question or the some clarity that I required on that is the freedom is linked, means we know that the freedom is linked with the quality of life of human being. So when we talk about the quality of life, as we know in our country India, it's tentatively not in a proper ratio. If I say only 3% of the people, they are actually living the high quality of life. Is there any measurement where we can identify that, or we can sectionize on the basis of that this quality of life means this type of freedom? Or another means as I haven't read means I read Amartya Sen's few articles and book of freedom development as freedom, not the other books that you have mentioned. And that over here, did he mention about that in which way this quality of life that the people will go through, or we can say that we developed, not a freedom, I say the quality of life will be linked with the freedom, and if is that freedom is the development, in which way that we are going to categorize it? Because the thing is that we know that the government is making so many reservation policies to enhance the quality of life of the people so that they can get the freedom. And is that enhancing of or giving them free education or giving them a job or whatever the aspects, or removing of the caste system, or taking care of making the people out from the religious sentiments, that the superstitious belief and all, does all this thing is helping the people to get a good quality of life that will lead to the freedom, and then we say it is developing our country or developing ourself? This thing I have some means even I have read Amartya Sen, but this is the lack that means I'm not getting the answer of this. If you have anything to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I think that my answer, I mean, your question is probably similar to the previous one. In a way, you're asking for an explanation or a causal mechanism which goes from, capabilities, functionings, to some notion of quality of life, right? So how does, I mean, suppose we do A, how does B happen? And that's a question you're asking. And I think that, I mean, my sense, I mean, again, it's not that I've read all work of Amartya Sen to be able to say it conclusively, but my sense is that that causal mechanism is not very strong. Right? And which is why most of the work, if you look at the capabilities approach, has been at measurement. So let's say the Human Development Index, or you come up with multiple indices, but what is the actual explanation or what is the actual causal mechanism? I think it still remains to be understood well. And maybe here, I mean, this is where probably we need to take, or we need to engage with other social sciences to have a better causal story of this. But so one is about what I think academic disciplines can do, but then there's also a question of what people want. Right? So on one side, you might have an economist or a development professional say that this is how your quality of life will improve. But there could be a particular tribe or a group of people who believe that this is the way we want to live. right? So, and then there can be some sort of a conflict between what comes from, let's say, an economist or a development professional versus what a person wants. So there is this conflict also, and I don't think any kind of theory can actually resolve it. It has to be through some sort of a dialogue or some sort of a democratic engagement. Again, so the question that you're asking, I think, are largely in the realm of one is the question of causation, and the other is if there is some sort of what you want and what somebody else wants are at loggerheads with each other, what do we do? But I don't think there can be any theory for it, or maybe equation for it, or economists, I don't know how we can handle it. I think that it has to be through some sort of wider public dialogue.
One more question from Philip George. Philip George, you can unmute yourself and ask.
Yeah, what I wanted to know was, what is your position on the marginalist and approach?
Okay. So personally, I have several dissatisfactions with the marginalist approach. And I think that the alternative approach, which is the surplus approach in the tradition of Smith and other people, are much more valuable and much more richer. But given that marginalist approach is the dominant approach to understanding economics, I also think that all of us as students or teachers of economics have to engage with it closely and critically. Again, and I think it really depends on, again, what is it that you or one wants to achieve, because if it is about policy action, as I pointed out in the case of public education, by adopting any of them, you can arrive at the same policy conclusion. But again, as students or teachers of economics, I think that it's important for the students, especially, I think, to be exposed to multiple ways of thinking in economics, multiple paradigms, multiple schools of thought.
No more questions, so we can end this just one.
Thank you, sir, for answering our queries. I'm certain that the session was really enriching. Thank you, sir. Dear participants, kindly take note. We will be sending the feedback form through email. I repeat, the attendees shall receive the feedback form through email. Please do fill up and fetch your certificate of participation. Gratitude is the fairest blossom which springs from the soul. I invite Ms. Sheetal of second year MA Economics to propose the word of thanks.
Gratitude unlocks the fullness of life. It turns what we have to enough and more. I would like to extend our hearty thanks and deep appreciation to the resource person, Dr. Alex M. Thomas. Thank you, sir, for taking out your time from your busy schedule and delivering that excellent talk. I would like to place and record our hearty thanks to Father Augustine George, our principal, and our management for providing us with such a wonderful opportunity to learn from experts. Our sincere thanks to Dr. Vinoda Devi, Coordinator of Economics, for her untiring efforts to make this webinar fruitful. I would also like to thank our dear teachers for the guidance and support. Last but not the least, I thank all the audience for their patient listening. Thank you, one and all.
Thank you, Sheetal. Thank you all once again. Also, students, please ensure that you join for the third hour class on time. I repeat, Jayantians, please take note that you join for the third hour class on time. The session has now come to an end. The host can now end the meeting. Thank you all.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, Alex, sir.
Yeah, thank you so much, ma'am.